David stood by his mailbox, the crisp morning air doing little to cool the heat rising in his chest. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the thick, official-looking envelope marked with the HOA's seal. The words inside sent a jolt through his body. After review of community boundaries, your back acre has been reclassified as common property. David's breath hitched. His back acre, his land, was now being claimed by the HOA. He read the letter again, his hands shaking. This wasn't just any piece of land. It was his grandfather's legacy, passed down through 3 generations. It was where his father had taught him how to build a fire, where he had spent his summers helping his grandfather tend to the garden. Now, in one bureaucratic move, the HOA had wiped that history away. His jaw clenched as anger coursed through him. There had to be a mistake. They couldn't just take his land like this. Without a second thought, he turned on his heel and stormed down the street toward Eleanor Winter's house, the HOA president and the woman behind this madness. David's knuckles rapped sharply against Eleanor's pristine white door. He could hear faint classical music playing inside, the sound of someone moving about. A few seconds later, the door swung open, and there she stood. Eleanor Winters looked effortlessly composed, dressed in fitted workout clothes, her blonde hair tied in a neat ponytail. Her smile was picture perfect, but it didn't reach her eyes. "David," she greeted, arching a perfectly shaped brow. "Can I help you with something?" David held up the letter, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "This says you're taking my land. There must be some mistake." Eleanor took a quick glance at the letter, but didn't even pretend to be surprised. Instead, she let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Oh, David, there's no mistake. Our professional survey shows that your grandfather's old, hand-drawn maps were incorrect. The board voted unanimously last night to correct the boundary lines." David's stomach twisted. "Without telling me?" Eleanor sighed dramatically, glancing at her manicured nails. "The HOA bylaws don't require prior notification for property corrections." She looked back at him with a placating smile. "We're planning a wonderful resort-style pool there. It's a community enhancement project, and believe me, everyone will benefit. Even you." David took a step forward, his voice firm. "I've been paying taxes on that land for 15 years. You can't just take it." Eleanor tilted her head, her expression as smooth as glass. "Oh, but legally we can, and we have." Before David could argue, the sound of music and laughter drifted through the air from the house next door. Eleanor glanced over her shoulder and smiled, this time genuinely. "I should go," she said lightly. "Tyler and Samantha are hosting the neighborhood welcome party. You should come. It might help you adjust to the changes." David barely noticed as she shut the door in his face. His heart pounded as he gripped the letter in his hand, his mind racing. He turned and started walking back home, but his gaze drifted toward the Morgans' house. Through the fence, he saw them laughing with their guests, gathered around their brand-new backyard pool, built suspiciously close to his property line. His stomach churned. How long had they known? That night, David lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the muffled thump of music from next door carried on through the walls. He checked the time, 1 a.m. He tried calling Tyler. No answer. 1:15 a.m., he knocked on their door. Tyler finally answered, red-faced, holding a half-empty beer bottle. "Hey, man," he slurred. "Party's over." "What's up?" David's patience was razor thin. "It's almost 1:30. Some of us work tomorrow." "Nah," Samantha appeared behind Tyler, her smile too sweet to be genuine. "Relax, David. We stopped the music right at 1. Check the bylaws." David took a deep breath. "Speaking of bylaws," he said slowly, "did you know about the HOA plan for my back acre?" The way both their faces shifted, guilt flashing across their expressions, told him everything. "You did," David muttered, his voice low. "You knew they were stealing my land." Tyler ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "Not stealing," Samantha corrected. "Reallocating. The resort will have a lap pool for serious swimmers, cabanas, a cocktail bar. It'll be amazing." David stared at them, his mind churning. A lap pool, cabanas, a cocktail bar, on his property. Tyler shrugged, clearly trying to play it cool. It's not personal, man. Eleanor showed us the real property lines. Your grandfather's maps were wrong. David didn't say another word. He turned and walked away, his mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts at once. Back home, he climbed into the attic, pulling down the old wooden chest his grandfather had left behind. Dust swirled in the dim light as he unlatched it, carefully pulling out a stack of yellowed documents. The original property deed. He spread the papers across his kitchen table, his pulse quickening as he examined the old maps under the warm glow of the lamp. His grandfather's maps followed natural landmarks: the creek, the oak tree, the rocky ridge. The HOA's newly drawn boundary lines? They ignored those completely. Instead, they carved out a perfect, straight-edge section, one that conveniently cut off his most valuable acre. David's fingers tightened around the papers. This wasn't an accident. This was a setup. As he leaned in closer, he noticed small writing in the corner of the deed, something he had never paid attention to before. It referenced county survey markers from 1952. His breath caught. If those markers still existed, he had proof. His grip on the document steadied. His rage was still there, burning hot, but now he had something else too. A plan. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Ace. David sat at his kitchen table, his grandfather's old property documents spread out before him. The yellowed pages told a different story than the HOA's so-called official survey. His land wasn't community property. It had been in his family for 3 generations. The HOA was lying. But proving it? That was another battle entirely. His phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It was Mark, his best friend and a local contractor. "David, I just heard what's happening," Mark said, his voice tense. "I need to warn you, this isn't the first time the HOA has done something like this." David gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" Mark sighed. "Remember the Hendersons? Last summer, they got hit with a bunch of sudden HOA violations. Fines, warnings, threats of foreclosure. Then out of nowhere, they sold their home and left." David frowned. "I thought they moved because of a job offer." "That's what they told everyone," Mark said bitterly. "But the truth? The HOA pressured them out. Once they left, guess what happened? Their house was bought under market value by Eleanor's daughter." David's stomach twisted. "You think she's trying to do the same thing to me?" "I don't think, David. I know." David felt his pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't just about a resort. Eleanor had been playing a long game, manipulating property values, forcing people out, and taking whatever she wanted. "She's not just stealing your land," Mark continued. "She's stealing your home." David clenched his jaw. "Not if I can help it." Determined, David decided to confront his neighbors, Tyler and Samantha Morgan. He stormed across the street and knocked on their door. When Tyler opened it, his expression was wary, like he already knew why David was there. "We need to talk," David said flatly. Tyler sighed and stepped aside, letting him in. Samantha sat on the couch, sipping wine, her eyes flickering with guilt. "You knew," David accused. "You knew about the HOA's plan, didn't you?" Tyler rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, man, it's not like that." "Then what is it like?" David snapped. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you knew they were stealing my land, and you said nothing." Samantha set her glass down and crossed her arms. "David, don't be dramatic. It's not stealing. The HOA is just making things right." "Making things right?" David let out a hollow laugh. "They're taking my land to build a damn resort." Tyler exhaled, looking away. "It's not personal, Dave." David took a step closer. "Not personal? You built a whole damn pool, knowing the land wasn't yours." Tyler's eyes flashed with guilt, but Samantha rolled her eyes. "Look, Eleanor showed us the property maps. Your grandfather's survey was outdated. This is how it is now." David stared at them, the betrayal sinking deep into his gut. These were people he had considered friends, people he had trusted. He turned toward the door. David, don't be stupid, Samantha called after him. You can't fight the HOA, just accept it. David didn't respond, because he knew something they didn't. He wasn't accepting anything. Back home, David spread the documents out again. There had to be something, some proof that could shut Eleanor down for good. That's when he saw it again, the small, barely noticeable text at the corner of his grandfather's deed. Survey markers, county documentation, 1952. His breath caught. If the original survey markers still existed, they would prove the HOA's claim was a lie. But he couldn't do this alone. David scrolled through his phone until he found the contact he needed. James Jacobson. Jacobson was a retired land surveyor who had worked with David's father years ago. If anyone could help him, it was him. David hit dial. After a few rings, a deep, gruff voice answered. Jacobson speaking. James, it's David Jackson. I need your help. I think the HOA is trying to steal my land. Silence, then a slow, knowing exhale. Tell me everything. David did. The letter, the fake survey, the rushed construction plans. When he was done, Jacobson cursed under his breath. I had a feeling something like this was happening. Eleanor's been playing dirty for years. Can you help me? David asked. There was no hesitation. Meet me at your place tomorrow morning. If those markers still exist, we'll find them. David barely slept that night. His mind was racing with possibilities. What if the markers were gone? What if he couldn't prove anything before construction started? The next morning, his phone buzzed with a new HOA announcement. Community notice. Groundbreaking for Pine Crest Resort begins Tuesday. Please remove any personal belongings from the designated area. David's heart pounded. Tuesday. That gave him 5 days. 5 days to stop them. He clenched his fists. That was all the time he needed. Eleanor had no idea what was coming. The next morning, David stood at the edge of his property, gripping a steaming cup of coffee as the sun crept over the horizon. Today was the day. If the original 1952 survey markers were still buried beneath all this overgrowth, he could prove the HOA was lying. A truck rumbled into his driveway. James Jacobson, the retired surveyor, stepped out, his grizzled face set in a no-nonsense expression. He wore an old flannel shirt, work boots, and a tool belt slung over his shoulder. You ready? Jacobson asked. David nodded. Let's find those markers. Jacobson pulled a metal detector from his truck and powered it on. If they're still here, we'll find them. David led him toward the back acre, where the HOA had claimed the land was community property. He scanned the area, his gut twisting at the thought of heavy machinery rolling in next week. Jacobson swept the metal detector slowly over the ground, listening for a signal. The beep, beep, beep of the device echoed through the early morning air. David held his breath. Nothing. They moved deeper into the property, past the old oak tree his grandfather had once told him was a marker. Suddenly, beep, beep, beep. Jacobson stopped, his eyes sharpened. We got something, he muttered, kneeling. David watched anxiously as the old surveyor grabbed a shovel and started digging. After a few minutes, metal scraped against metal. Jacobson cursed under his breath. Bingo! He pulled out a rusted survey stake from beneath the soil. It was old but intact. David's heart pounded. That's from the 1952 survey? Jacobson wiped off the dirt and examined the markings. Sure as hell is. And if this one is still here, the others should be too. They spent the next 2 hours digging. By the time they were done, they had found 4 markers, each proving what David had suspected all along. His land wasn't just intact, it was even bigger than what he had been maintaining. The HOA's new boundaries had conveniently cut off nearly 2 acres from his property. David let out a slow breath. He had them. As they packed up, Jacobson frowned, looking over an old geological map. You ever wonder why your granddad's survey followed natural landmarks? He asked. David shrugged. I figured it was just old-school mapping. Jacobson shook his head. Not just that. This ridge right here. He pointed at a rocky formation on the edge of David's land. This was flagged by a geological survey in the 50s. Potential archaeological site. David frowned. What kind of site? Jacobson's eyes darkened. Native American artifacts were found around here in the 1940s. Arrowheads, pottery shards. Your grandfather probably knew, but back then, it didn't matter. Today, though, if we find evidence of an archaeological site, this entire area could be legally protected. David's pulse quickened. If that was true, HOA wouldn't just lose the resort plan, they'd be legally barred from developing anything here. He swallowed hard. Who would know for sure? The Historical Society, Jacobson said. If you file an emergency preservation request, they're required to investigate. If they confirm it, that land is locked down. Permanently. David didn't hesitate. This was his trump card. Until, back at his house, David dialed the number for the local Historical Society. His fingers drummed impatiently against the table as the phone rang. A woman's voice answered. Maple Ridge Historical Society. This is Maria speaking. Maria, my name is David Jackson, he said quickly. I need to report a potential Native American archaeological site on my property. A pause. Then, what makes you think that? David explained everything. His grandfather's maps, the old survey, the artifacts mentioned in past records. When he was done, Maria let out a low whistle. That's significant. If what you're saying is true, this land could qualify for immediate historical protection. How fast can you send someone out? David asked. Maria sighed. Official investigations take time, but if you file an emergency preservation notice, it will halt any development until a full survey is done. How do I do that? You'll need to submit documentation at the county office. I can send you the forms. David's hands tightened into fists. This was it. If I do this, he said, does it stop construction? Legally? Yes. The county can't approve any development until the site is assessed. It puts a hold on everything. David exhaled. Send me the forms. A few hours later, David sat in his truck, gripping the signed emergency preservation request. Once he filed this, the HOA's entire plan could collapse. But as he reached for the door handle, his phone buzzed. A new message from the HOA. Community notice. Construction to begin Monday morning, 1 day ahead of schedule. Please remove all personal items from the designated area. David's breath caught. Monday. They had moved up the start date. It wasn't a coincidence. They knew. Somehow Eleanor had found out about his investigation. She was rushing the construction before he could stop them. David's grip tightened around the steering wheel. He had 4 days left. And now it was a race against time. David sat in his truck outside the county records office, his fingers drumming impatiently against the steering wheel. He had called in a favor from Vince, his cousin who worked in the archives department. If there was any dirt on Eleanor Winters and her shady land grab, Vince would find it. His phone buzzed. A text from Vince. Got something big. Meet me at the back entrance. Now. David's heart pounded as he stepped out of the truck and made his way around the building. Vince was already there, holding a thick manila folder. His face was serious. You're not gonna believe this, Vince said, thrusting the folder into David's hands. David flipped it open. Inside were property acquisition records, company filings, and internal HOA documents. The first document hit him like a punch to the gut. Eleanor Winters was married to Richard Calloway, the CEO of Lakeside Developments. David's grip tightened. Lakeside Developments, the same real estate firm that had been quietly buying up land in surrounding areas, turning neighborhoods into luxury vacation rentals. His stomach twisted as he scanned the next document. The HOA wasn't just building a pool. They were turning his land into a full-fledged private resort. The plans included a luxury pool with cabanas and a cocktail bar, a high-end spa and wellness center, exclusive vacation homes for rent. And the worst part? The project was already funded by outside investors. David clenched his jaw. Eleanor had never intended this to be a community upgrade. This was a land grab, one designed to make millions. David exhaled, his mind racing. He needed more. Proof that could expose Eleanor beyond any doubt. Vince hesitated, then pulled out one last file. "This is where it gets worse," he muttered. Inside was a transcript, a partial recording from a private HOA meeting held 2 weeks ago. David's pulse quickened as he read the words. Eleanor Winters. "The board doesn't need to know every detail. As long as we push this through before any legal challenges, we're in the clear." Unknown investor. "And what if Jackson resists?" Eleanor Winters. "He won't have a choice. If we squeeze him out, he'll be forced to sell, or we'll find a way to remove him." David's hands tightened around the papers. She knew. She knew the land wasn't legally hers, but she was banking on him, folding under pressure. This wasn't just corruption. It was premeditated fraud. David knew he had to act fast. If he went public with this now, the HOA's entire operation would collapse. But there was one problem. If Eleanor realized he had this information, she'd do everything to silence him. He needed to make sure she didn't see it coming. David pulled out his phone and called Mark, his contractor friend. "Mark, I need to borrow some of your security equipment." Mark hesitated. "What for?" David stared at the transcript in his hand. "I'm about to record the conversation that'll bury Eleanor Winters for good." The next afternoon, David showed up at the HOA office unannounced. Eleanor was sitting behind her large oak desk, flipping through paperwork when she saw him. Her smile was tight. "David," she said smoothly, "what a surprise. What can I do for you?" David sat down across from her, sliding the HOA letter across the table. "We need to talk about this." Eleanor barely glanced at it. "David, I've already explained." "Cut the act," David interrupted. He leaned forward, his voice dangerously calm. "I know about lakeside developments. I know about the investors. And I know that this isn't about a pool. It's about a private resort on stolen land." For the first time, Eleanor's mask cracked. David pressed forward. "I have the county records, the investment contracts, and a recording of your little secret meeting." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." David pulled out his phone and hit play. Eleanor's own voice filled the office. "The board doesn't need to know every detail. As long as we push this through before any legal challenges, we're in the clear." Silence. Eleanor's face went pale. "You were saying?" David asked. For a moment, she didn't move. Then her expression hardened. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, Jackson," she said, her voice low. David smirked. "Oh, I think I do." Eleanor stood up, her hands flat on the desk. "If you release that, I'll bury you in legal fees. You won't be able to afford to fight this." David leaned back, completely unfazed. "That's the thing about the truth, Eleanor. It doesn't need a lawyer." Her nostrils flared. "What do you want?" David's smile didn't waver. "I want an HOA emergency meeting, tonight, in front of the entire neighborhood. You're going to explain exactly what you did, and when this is over, you're going to resign." Eleanor let out a slow, controlled breath. "And if I don't?" David's expression darkened. "Then I take this to the state attorney's office, and you go to jail for fraud." Silence stretched between them. Then finally, Eleanor sat back down. Her face was stone cold, but she knew she had lost. "Fine," she muttered. "Tonight." David stood, slipping his phone back into his pocket. See you there." David walked out of the HOA office, a weight lifting off his chest. But this wasn't over yet. Eleanor wasn't the type to go down without a fight. She still had connections. She still had power. And she still had one last move to play. David just had to make sure he was 3 steps ahead. David sat on his front porch, staring at his phone. 3 missed calls from an unknown number. He knew who it was. Eleanor was panicking. Tonight's HOA meeting was set. In just a few hours, he would expose her corruption in front of the entire neighborhood. But he wasn't naive. Eleanor wouldn't go down without a fight. A black SUV pulled up in front of his house. David narrowed his eyes as Eleanor Winters stepped out, this time with a uniformed police officer by her side. David's jaw clenched. So this was her next move. Eleanor smiled sweetly as she approached, but David could see the calculation in her eyes. The officer, Deputy Wilson, was a man in his 40s, looking uncomfortable as he adjusted his belt. "David," Eleanor greeted him smoothly, "I'm so glad we caught you at home." David didn't move from his porch. "Didn't realize I was being hunted." Eleanor let out a small laugh. "Oh, don't be dramatic." Then she turned to Wilson. "Deputy, I called you here because I'm concerned for David's well-being. His behavior has been erratic lately." David's eyes darkened. She was trying to paint him as unstable. Deputy Wilson sighed. "Sir, we've received reports that you've been trespassing on community land and harassing board members. There's also been talk about you making threats." David exhaled sharply. "Let me guess. HOA members are the ones making these claims?" Wilson hesitated. "Well, yes." David folded his arms. "Did they also tell you they're illegally seizing private property and covering it up with falsified survey documents?" Wilson looked uncertain. Good. He wasn't fully on Eleanor's side yet. Eleanor gave a fake sympathetic sigh. "David, no one's trying to steal from you, but we can't ignore the fact that you've been obsessed with this, spreading conspiracy theories, harassing neighbors." David smirked. "And let me guess, your solution is to have me declared mentally unstable?" Eleanor's smile didn't waver. "If you refuse to seek help, the board may have to take legal action. For your own well-being, of course." Wilson shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sold on her act, but Eleanor had power in this town. If she pushed hard enough, she could make David's life a nightmare. But she didn't know what David had. "Deputy Wilson," David said calmly, pulling out his phone, "I think you should take a look at something before making any decisions." David tapped his screen, and a security camera video played. The footage showed HOA workers on his land, illegally setting up construction stakes. Wilson's brows furrowed. "Where was this taken?" "Yesterday. My property." Eleanor's expression flickered. "That proves nothing." David swiped to another clip. This one showed Eleanor at the HOA office speaking to a group of investors. "Eleanor Winters, we just have to keep him distracted long enough to break ground. Once construction starts, he'll have no choice but to back down." Wilson's expression hardened. "Is this real?" David gave a slow nod. "Every word, and I have more." Eleanor's face turned pale, but she recovered quickly. "David, this is out of context." David turned to Wilson. "Deputy, I assume trespassing and falsifying legal documents are bigger offenses than acting erratic, right?" Wilson sighed. "I'd say so." He turned to Eleanor, his patience wearing thin. "Ma'am, I think you and the HOA need to explain some things." Eleanor's mask cracked. She was losing control. But she wasn't done yet. 2 hours later, the HOA emergency meeting was packed. More than 100 residents had gathered. Eleanor stood at the podium, her confident smile now forced in tight. "As your HOA president," she began, "I've always put this community first. The recent misunderstandings surrounding the Pinecrest Resort project have caused unnecessary division." David stood in the back, arms crossed. Unnecessary division? She was trying to steal land. One of the board members, Diana Chin, stood up. "Eleanor, you told us this was a simple community upgrade. You never mentioned private investors." Eleanor waved a dismissive hand. "It was a minor oversight." "Minor oversight?" Another board member, Frank Thompson, interrupted. "You had a deal in place before we even voted." Murmurs spread through the room. People were angry. David stepped forward. "I have evidence proving Eleanor has been lying to all of you." He walked up to the projector and inserted a USB drive. The HOA's secret meeting recording played for the entire room. Eleanor's voice rang out. "The board doesn't need to know every detail. As long as we push this through before any legal challenges, we're in the clear." The reaction was instant. Gasps, outrage, board members whispering furiously amongst themselves. David locked eyes with Eleanor. Checkmate. Diana Chin turned to the rest of the board. "I motion for an immediate vote of no confidence in Eleanor Winters as HOA president." Frank Thompson raised his hand. Seconded. Wait. Eleanor's voice rose, panic creeping in. You can't do this. Actually, Diana interrupted, smiling for the first time all night. We can. David stood by the exit as residents lined up to cast their votes. He didn't need to count. He knew how this would end. After 15 minutes, Diana Chin stepped up to the podium. The votes have been tallied. Eleanor Winters is officially removed as HOA president. Applause erupted. Eleanor stood frozen, her face blank. It was over. David walked up beside her. Looks like you're out of moves. Eleanor turned, her gaze dark with fury. Then without a word, she stormed out. David let out a slow breath. For the first time in weeks, he felt free. As people celebrated around him, David's phone buzzed. A text from Vince. David, you need to see this. Eleanor isn't done. She's got one last card to play. David's stomach tightened. What the hell was she planning now? Then without a word, she stormed out. David let out a slow breath. For the first time in weeks, he felt free. As people celebrated around him, David's phone buzzed. A text from Vince. David, you need to see this. Eleanor isn't done. She's got one last card to play. David's stomach tightened. What the hell was she planning now? David leaned against his truck, staring at the HOA office as neighbors filed out, still buzzing from Eleanor's public humiliation. The once mighty Eleanor Winters had been voted out as HOA president, but David knew she wasn't done yet. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Vince. David, county officials are reviewing your emergency historical preservation request. If it's approved, HOA can never touch your land again. But Eleanor just requested a meeting with the mayor. She's trying to override it. David's jaw clenched. Of course she was. She had already lost her position, but she wasn't going down alone. She was trying to pull every string she had left. But David was ready. The next morning, David arrived at the county planning office with a thick folder under his arm. He wasn't alone. Maria from the Historical Society and James Jacobson, the retired surveyor, were right beside him. Eleanor was already there, standing near a group of well-dressed men, her last allies. She turned as David walked in, her eyes narrowing. You're really dragging this out, aren't you? David smirked. Oh, I'm just getting started. A county official, Mr. Lawson, cleared his throat. We've reviewed the documentation on both sides. Mr. Jackson has requested an emergency preservation order on his land. Mrs. Winters, you've requested an override based on HOA development interests. Let's hear both cases. Eleanor stepped forward first, her voice smooth and polished. Mr. Lawson, the HOA's project is for the benefit of the entire community. We've already secured investments, and this last-minute claim is nothing more than an attempt to block progress. She shot a glare at David before continuing. We urge the county to dismiss this baseless request and allow development to proceed. Lawson nodded, then turned to David. Mr. Jackson? David placed his folder on the table. I have 3 things to present. He opened the first file, the 1952 survey markers, proving the HOA's new property lines are fraudulent. Eleanor's face twitched. David opened the second file. A legal statement from a county archaeologist confirming Native American artifacts were found on my land. Under state law, this qualifies for protected status. Murmurs spread through the room. Then, David pulled out a USB drive. And finally, security footage showing HOA members trespassing and illegally staking claims on my property before any legal decision was made. Lawson inserted the USB into his computer. The footage played for everyone to see. HOA board members marking land they knew wasn't theirs. David didn't need to say anything. The evidence spoke for itself. Lawson removed his glasses and exhaled. Well, this makes my decision very easy. He looked at Eleanor. The emergency preservation request is approved. Eleanor's body went rigid. Lawson continued. David Jackson's land is now legally protected. Not only is development permanently banned, but any prior HOA claims on his property are now null and void. David's chest expanded as relief washed over him. But Lawson wasn't finished. He glanced at Eleanor's investors. By the way, I'll be forwarding this case to the state attorney's office. I'm sure they'll have questions about how this HOA was operating. One of the investors snapped his briefcase shut and stormed out. Another followed. Eleanor stood frozen. Her entire plan had just gone up in flames. That evening, the remaining HOA board members held an emergency meeting. David didn't even need to be there. The damage was done. Within an hour, a neighborhood group chat exploded with messages. Breaking, 3 HOA board members resign after county ruling. Investors are pulling out. HOA resort project officially dead. Eleanor Winters under investigation for HOA fraud and illegal land acquisition. David leaned back in his chair, reading each message with satisfaction. She had tried to take his land. Now she had lost everything. The next morning, as David walked out to get his mail, he saw a moving truck parked in front of Eleanor's house. Workers were loading furniture into it. Eleanor herself stood by the curb, her usual perfect posture now slumped. Her once flawless image was shattered. David approached, stopping a few feet away. "Moving out already?" he asked casually. Eleanor turned, her face pale and drawn. "Not a word, Jackson." David chuckled. "What happened to all that power?" Eleanor's hands tightened into fists. "Enjoy this while you can. You think you won?" David smirked. "I don't think, I know." She stared at him for a long moment, then scoffed. Without another word, she climbed into her car and drove away. David watched as she disappeared down the street. She was gone. For good. That weekend, the neighborhood hosted a community barbecue. The same people who once ignored David, who sided with Eleanor, were now shaking his hand. Samantha Morgan approached him, shifting awkwardly. "Hey, David, listen. Tyler and I, we were wrong." David raised an eyebrow. "You don't say." She exhaled. "We should have stood with you. And for what it's worth, we're sorry." David let the silence drag for a moment before giving a small nod. "Make sure it never happens again." Samantha smiled. "Fair enough." As the night settled, David sat on his porch, watching the stars. His land, his family's legacy, was safe, forever. His phone buzzed. A text from Vince. "Final update. Eleanor's company took a massive financial hit. She's bankrupt." David grinned. The woman who tried to steal everything from him now had nothing. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Justice had been served. David stood at the edge of his land, the warm morning sun casting long shadows over the grass. For the first time in weeks, his home finally felt like his again. No more threats, no more HOA interference. It was over. His land was officially protected, his family's legacy secured forever. But the war he had fought left scars on the community, on his reputation, and on the HOA itself. In the weeks that followed, the HOA underwent massive changes. With Eleanor gone and the corrupt board members resigning, a new leadership was elected. This time, the people running things weren't power-hungry manipulators. They were real neighbors, people who actually cared about the community. Diana Chin, one of the few board members who had stood against Eleanor, became the new HOA president. At the first official meeting, she made a bold announcement. Effective immediately, all HOA rules regarding property disputes will be reviewed and revised. No homeowner will ever have to go through what David Jackson did. Applause erupted across the room. David didn't care much for HOA politics, but he had to admit it felt good to see justice play out. He had changed things. And now people respected him. The same neighbors who once ignored him, who took Eleanor's side, were now the ones shaking his hand, thanking him for fighting back. Despite her humiliating defeat, Eleanor Winters didn't go quietly. The day she left town, David happened to see her one last time. She was standing by her car, watching as the last of her belongings were packed away. When she spotted David across the street, she didn't look angry anymore. She just smirked. Then she said 4 words that sent a chill down his spine. "This isn't over, Jackson." David folded his arms, watching her get into the car and drive away. A part of him wanted to believe she was just bluffing, but deep down, he knew better. One evening, as David sat on his porch, his phone buzzed with a message from Vince. "Need to talk ASAP. Something big is happening." David frowned and immediately called him back. "Vince, what's going on?" Vince's voice was tense. "David, I've been digging through some land records and I found something bad." David sat up straight. "How bad?" Vince hesitated. "There's a big real estate corporation eyeing our entire neighborhood. They've been quietly buying up properties around town." David's stomach twisted. "Who are they?" Vince exhaled. "A development firm called Callaway Industries." David's grip on his phone tightened. Callaway. Eleanor's husband's company. She was gone, but her influence wasn't. Vince continued. "Listen, man, this isn't just about your land anymore. They're looking to buy out the whole neighborhood." David ran a hand down his face. He had barely finished one war, and another was already starting. The HOA had tried to steal his land. Now an entire corporation wanted the whole damn town. David stared out at his land, the wind rustling through the trees. He had won this battle, but now a bigger enemy was coming. And this time it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone. His fists clenched. HOA tried to take what was his, and he crushed them. Now a billion-dollar company wanted his town? Let them try. David Jackson wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. To be continued.